You're live.
Testing 1, 2, 3. I have no clue. It's our first time using YouTube directly instead of YouNow for this kind of live streaming.
It works.
So I don't know. It says new live chat replay. Oh, so then we can upload it to thing. So this, in case you're tempted to edit, this takes the editor's power out of your hands. You can't edit if we post it to YouTube in this format. But currently, I'm not recording it in any other format. Right. Shout out to David. Shout out to everyone in New Zealand who's awake at this time. This is 10:30 p.m. on the West Coast. Yeah. So yeah, this is prime time in New Zealand. And all right, yeah. Okay, so we got a bunch of different topics to talk about. But what is this going to go to YouTube as just one video?
I think so.
Because in that case, we should do just one topic, and then I should title it accordingly, right? Like we can just do the Russian film. That's what you're ready to do. Yeah, let's do that. Yeah. I think I think that makes sense. So guys, we're going to talk about the most edgy and worthwhile topic of 2018, communism. People must be now. Look, I joke, but recently I watched some videos criticizing the Nazis, the Nazis in World War II, and I commented to you at the time. I said, Melissa, just watch these videos. I posted some to Twitter and stuff. They were good. They were interesting videos. But so you know what the truth is, even though that stuff is interesting, I've done plenty of reading about the history of fascism. It's not really relevant to present political concerns the way the history of communism is. So I do get requests. One of my longtime fans, Alec, he wrote to me complaining. He said, "Why do you always use examples from communism and Catholicism?" That was his complaint. And you don't use examples so much of fascism or what was the other example? Fascism or I forget. Fascism or imperialism. Okay. I talk about imperialism a fair bit. Sure. Yeah. Well, you remember I had a cartoonist making fun of me recently, and in the cartoon making fun of me, he said I equally cast aspersions on left and right. On anyway. Yeah. I'm not trying to go for a perfect 50-50 ratio, but yeah. Anyway, but my answer to that partly is, I really do think the critique of the left is productive. It's relevant to my life. It's relevant to a lot of real world regimes I got to deal with. It was relevant to my life even in Toronto, though. You've heard me say a lot about that. And I don't know if you've seen some signs of that now. Okay, let's just ask that before we get into communism proper. Because look, you've just contrasted what life is like in Michigan to Seattle to Vancouver and Victoria. I mean, I know you didn't get
we
deeply,
weren't living in Seattle.
But I mean, I don't know. Do you feel Canada is way more left wing than the United States? Do you think the sense of what's normal, the political spectrum here, is further to the left?
From what you've told me about it, that's the impression I get. But I haven't lived here that long. And
well, we're not debating abortion here. I mean, just as an example, right?
Yeah.
What isn't Trump now talking about making abortion illegal in the States? So that debate isn't over in the States. Here it's over,
Yeah, that's true.
Things like, do you teach sexual education in schools? That stuff's over here. We had gay marriage before the States too. I mean, I can't say it's dramatically further to the left, but I mean, my experience of downtown Toronto was really left wing.
Yeah.
And that's also the thing. So I've seen a study of this in the UK and England. But there's also a sense in which people become self-selecting and those political patterns become self-reinforcing. So like within England, only a certain type of personality wants to live in downtown London. It's noisy, it's crowded, it's competitive. And people who don't like that, even if they're from downtown London, completely appropriate shirt for the video too. Even if you're from downtown London originally, be careful not to just the mic. You will. Do you want to move forward? Move for sure.
Okay.
But even if you're from downtown London originally, you'll move elsewhere. So I think there's some of that going on too. Even just the suburbs of Toronto would have been more conservative than downtown Toronto. But yeah, in case you guys don't know, I've talked about this in the past. We're going to talk about it in some depth now. I grew up with communist parents, and I normally have to reiterate those people. It's the worst with academics. A lot of people hear that and think, "Oh, you mean you had liberal, left-wing hippie parents who were into Buddhism and yoga and sympathized with Nicaraguan rebels or something?" No, my parents were real communists, and that included, hating Buddhism and justifying, the massacres of Buddhists by Mao Zedong, supporting, crackdown on Buddhists in Tibet, by the Chinese. They were real hardcore communists who really believed, really justified mass murder, really justified the atrocities of communist
Yeah, but when you
so
say that they supported it,
yes,
what exactly do you mean by that? Like they weren't actually they would tell you that they were in favor of these
right.
What you just mentioned, sorry.
Yeah, and more. Yeah, sure. I mean, it's not
okay.
it's not that passive. I mean, Canada had communist parties. It had real political organizations they'd be members of, and they'd donate money to, and they'd subscribe to their newspapers, and they would, So, I mean, when they were younger, they were actively involved in activism, which included, protests and political events and publications, publishing books, and giving lectures and organizing things and trying to infiltrate. And communists are always in this, trying to infiltrate labor unions. When I was growing up, they, all their time was devoted to their business, their completely capitalist business, of course.
Yeah.
But
right.
so that activist side of it had passed out of their lives. There was also the fact that they were basically in a situation where they were backstabbed by other communists. And of course, other communists perceived them as backstabbing other people. And, as they tell the story, they were afraid for their lives. They thought they'd actually be murdered by other members of the communist movement they've been a part of. Now, my father had great difficulty telling the truth about anything. So, I have more than one kind of perspective on that. That story is hard for me to tell because I have to throughout it put in asterisks and say, well, this is the way he tells it. Here's what I know from other sources, et cetera. However, communists have a tremendous history of massacring other communists. And, even in Afghanistan, even in places you don't associate with communism, I put up my hand in class. So, just to mention, Afghanistan is still to this day not that densely populated a country. I put up my hand in class, in my class on communism, history of communism at UVic. And I said, Professor, a really short question, because he really didn't have time for, I wasn't asking long Swiss questions. I said, I've seen textbooks and so on. Move your chair forward, babe. You don't have to. I mean, sorry.
I can't move it anymore.
Okay. So you comfortable or no?
It's fine.
Okay. You want a pillow?
No, it's fine.
Okay. No edits. Keep rolling. Anyway, in Afghanistan, I said, the textbook sources and so on, they say like an over 1 million body count. Like talking about 1 million people being killed in communist sectarian violence. So like one group of communists fighting against another and getting over 1 million. I said, are these body counts legitimate? And the professor said, yes, to my knowledge, these are legitimate. So you have these unbelievable, now Cambodia is another one where just because it's such a small country, a lot of people who are not like Holocaust deniers, they wonder how credible the numbers are. And I've been through the math. There's a famous essay that's titled Counting Hell. That's the title, Counting Hell, about the different efforts to put a body count, a precise body count, how many people the communists killed. But a lot of the violence, including under Lenin, when communism started in Russia, the 1917 to 1921 kind of period, a lot of their massacres right off the bat, were of communist on communist, not the enemies of communism, but what they perceived of. So I just say, in that sense, that's part of the background of that situation. But whether or not my parents were really rolling with a bunch of killers, that's another question. But they took communism seriously, and they felt the other people in the movement took it seriously enough to have them killed when they started to fall out of favor with the leadership, and they fled. As my father tells the story, they fled for their lives. But there were a lot of reasons. Well, anyway, from other communists. So they were living in southern Ontario generally. My impression is they moved around a lot because of the movement. Again, this is what communists are into.
Okay, so
organizing labor unions.
That's why you moved quite a bit.
Well, no, but it really ended when my memory starts. So I was born in Ottawa, but they didn't live in Ottawa for long. My impression is, my father originally is from a steel mill town. I mean, in that sense, he's an authentic working class, communist. His mother worked in a steel factory. His mom was a single mom working in the steel factory. So, unlike the kind of stereotypical bourgeois champagne socialist, my father did come from a working class background in a steel town. So I think a lot of his organizing was there. But, it's like a 1-hour drive between Hamilton and Toronto. So I think they were in the greater Toronto, Southern Ontario area. But like, if you ask me where were they living, to what extent it was Toronto versus Hamilton versus that, versus Guelph. I think they did move around on that scale during the period of their most intense communist activity. Anyway, so just briefly, this is the thing about a spontaneous conversation. We're not talking like analytically about just one topic. But one interesting element of that is that their particular group rose to fame because they published a poet. They published a book of poetry with kind of socialist and communist overtones. And then my father's book was supposed to be kind of the follow-up hit, like hit book. I mean, sorry, the word hit. In this context, you got to be careful. Anyway, it has more than one meaning in English. But yeah, so he wrote a book which was it's titled "The History of Art and Painting in Canada," and it's 100% communist, propaganda. It's unbelievable. You want to? How can this be communist?
Yeah.
Look at this book. Literally, if you leaf through it, one of the diagrams, like one of the illustrations, is of a working class man with a hard hat, a construction hat, knocking over the capitalist system. There's like a diagram and it shows like the workers, the capitalist system, and like there's like cracks in the system. It's like, oh, so this is how it works. So this explains.
I gotcha.
Yeah. Like it's that. Like when I say it's propaganda, like it's pretty transparent. Anyway, so I read that book. I'm guessing in my first year of university. And one of the only parts I could relate to positively, I talked to my father. I said, "Oh, well, you have all this stuff about First Nations, this stuff that like seems to really care about Canada's Indigenous people and so on." Mm-hmm. And I remember his response to that was just like, "Yeah, well, like for the movement, they required that kind of thing." Like he just regarded that as propaganda. This stuff about like the importance of First Nations and their culture and their future and so on. He regarded that as insincere. That was the only part of the book I could regard positively. Yeah.
So would you say that both of your parents were equally for communism? Because right. I compare it to like my experience with religion. When I was growing up, my mom was more of the religious person in our family. We wouldn't have gone to church if my mom hadn't been religious, because my dad often complained that we would have to go to church every Sunday. So it was obvious who was actually making us become Christians. Right. Was it anything like that, or were both of your parents?
So they both. I mean, before I was born, I think it's fair to say they were both 100% committed and sincere communists. Mm-hmm. Before I was born, my father was more of a Stalinist. So that was what inspired us to make this video, by the way. It was the Death of Stalin, this movie that came out once saw together. So it's the occasion for this video. Although generally, of course, this is an issue that comes up again and again. And my mother was more of a Maoist, was more towards the Chinese side of communism. The other element here really is Cuba and even Yugoslavia, because at that time, those were also contrasting forms of communism. And I've seen the evidence that my father was pro-Cuban. Probably when he first was getting into communism, that was the image of communism that drew him in, like when he was quite young. And even Yugoslavia was a kind of alternative to Stalinist communism. It's the communism of outright mass murder for incredibly poor reasons, by the way. Sorry, I just mentioned. So we saw this movie. This is different. We'll get back to my situation. But Stalin did things like he massacred everyone who could speak Esperanto. Like just everyone who speaks Esperanto. Stalin literally killed more German communists than Hitler did. Hitler carried out massacres of German communists, which is not surprising. But a huge number of German communists fled to Russia because they knew, they were anti-Nazi and they knew what the Nazi Party was about. So they were people who were pro-communist and sincerely went from Germany to Russia. Then after they got there and settled down, Stalin carried out purges, massacring those people. So again, to really continue supporting Joseph Stalin over those decades, the decades of my father's life, it's pretty mind-blowing to not crack and lose your faith. So I'm coming back to the question. So the question is, to what extent were my parents equally communist, or one more than the other? So I think before I was born, probably my mother and father equally were totally 100% pro-communist. But the question is then, how do you deal with the way your life fragments and the way the world fragments as you get older? Because communism is a childlike religion. It's childlike in its simplicity. Note here, by the way, if English is your second language, childlike is not the same as childish. I don't mean childish. I mean childlike. It's a digression, but it's a good one to have here. Like for my father, growing up in a steel town, poor, and hating rich people, there is a childlike simplicity to a political philosophy that just promises you can kill the rich. You can solve the problem by killing the factory owner. It's not a lot of analytical depth or sophistication. But then as you get older, so maybe when you're 15 or something, that makes sense to you. Not at 15, I was already pretty cynical. But my father.
Yeah, well, that's something that I was going to ask.
But maybe at 8 years old. I mean, it's childlike, and it's
Yeah, you mentioned to me the other day that you had a friend who ended up going to a private school once you got to middle school or whatever age
that's
that
right.
was,
that's
and
right.
it led to a falling out between you two. Because
I completely stopped talking. That's right. Yeah.
Right, because you went to a private school, not because you were at a distance from each other. It was actually because
he was in the same home.
Being in a private school meant that you were
bourgeois. He was a class enemy. That's right. When the next,
so your parents must have imbued this in you, because this is not taught in school.
No, that's right. It's 100%. That's right. He would. I mean, if you believe in communism, your family religion, then you believe there's a war coming. There's a civil war coming, like they had in Russia in 1917, where the rich fight against the poor, or like they had in China in the various purges after 1949. That your class enemies will be your literal blood enemies. That you'll kill each other. That's the utopia promised by communism. So somebody who identifies as someone who wears the uniform of the ruling class, of the aristocracy or whatever, that's to be a friend with some of that. I've told you this in the past, so sorry, digression. I think this has already been mentioned on YouTube. But it's directly answered this question. We should come back to your earlier question. But there was one kid in my school, and his parents were Nazis. Now, I'm not using Nazi in like a figurative sense here. I really do mean like they were Germans. They owned Doberman Pinschers. His father actually lost his job because of his commitment to Nazism. His father was fired from his job. I don't want to give too many details because people could actually figure out who this was in Toronto. But the story still, he was fired because of his racism. The father, and then the father became a taxi driver. Apparently earned a good living as a taxi driver. They seem to be doing all right. And all the sons, they all had these Nazi names. I'm not going to give the names, but like, if you know some things about German fascism, like they're giving their kids like weird names. So they were really hardcore Nazis.
Were any of them named Adolf?
It's not, no. The current term is dog whistling. There's a sense of it being a little bit coded, a little bit indirect. But anyway, but when I looked at that family, I could see that there's a parallelism between the kids growing up with fascism and racism. It was really racism was the main thing. And my growing up in a communist household, just in that they were growing up being taught, just like Christians believe the end of the world is coming, they were growing up being taught, like in the future, like, look, if you make friends with these kids who are of other races, guess what's coming in the future. In the same way I was being taught, if you make friends with kids of other social classes, the class struggle is coming.
Yeah.
And some people don't understand what class struggle means, and some people do. I mean, but that's what happened after 1917 and so on.
Yeah.
So that was an interesting parallel that clicked for me. Was, well, here are these kids being raised, being taught, Black people and Hispanics and so on were implicitly enemies. And likewise, there was a class, in my case, there's class struggle. Yeah. Anyway, so the original question we branched off from, I'm totally sorry. Take notes or whatever you want to do. Sorry, do you see me writing out something you want to ask?
Well, I keep thinking of questions that I'm going to ask.
Jot it down. Yeah. Good. Jot it down. But look, the question you asked before was, were they both equally kind of passionate about communism? So, when I was growing up, they were struggling with the kind of, round peg in a square hole reality of how different their real lives were from the ideology they preached. And they cope with that in different ways. My father, so I talked to my father a few times before he died. We didn't talk at all for a period of 10 years. But then when I did try to talk to him again, I remember he was trying to just deny that we were raised communist at all. He had these various excuses. I was like, oh, no, you weren't raised communist or whatever. And I remember saying to him, how often do you think around the dinner table, a Jewish family talks about Judaism and Jewish philosophy? Like if you're raising your kids Jewish. And, he was quite stunned at this question. And I said to him, Barry, like, do you not realize, like, every night for like 2 hours we'd talk about like communist politics, like most, like, there are some Jews, like if your father is a scholar of Judaism who's really passionate, maybe you grow up with this level of discussion.
That's crazy.
But yeah. But I'm just saying, it was really, and it was dinner table conversation, in depth. Sorry, there's one more big pointer coming up. But I said to my father, for a child growing up, like, you can't, like, even if a Jewish family never took their kids to temple, like, if you never took them to a ritual, if you grew up having this kind of in-depth discussion about, politics and philosophy and so on of Judaism every night, then your kids are raised Jewish. They're raised with a huge education in Judaism. And like, I grew up with these kinds of conversations. Well, when my father was in town all the time, he traveled a lot for business. I grew up literally with communist books on the shelf in my bedroom and in the family living room, which I did read. I could talk about what those books were and how, because I remember all this. I have a painfully accurate memory for all these details. But here's the big difference. But if you're raised Jewish, what you see in the outside world is what you see in the newspapers, and it's what you see, like maybe Jerry Seinfeld. So Jerry Seinfeld's a comedian who happens to be Jewish. So you see Judaism inside the family, and then you see it in the outside world in this different way. What made my parents' religion so powerful as a child for me was that you'd see the religion inside the household, and then in the newspapers and on the TV news, you saw a lot of the same things being confirmed, right? So there'd be just enough truth in what I was being told that when you're a child and you see, like, oh, Ronald Reagan is talking about nuclear bombs, people are talking about war with Russia, it affirmed for you what you were being told, right? There was enough factual content corresponding to problems in the real world that everyone was talking about, that the newspapers and the media of the day were talking about, that it made it all seem very real. And you don't have that by and large with Christianity and Judaism. I don't know, like, I guess once in a while there's a news item saying, oh, archaeologists are trying to find pieces of Noah's Ark. You know what I mean? Like, maybe there's some shit like that in the news. But in that sense, where it was being affirmed as real all the time, that's a big difference.
Yeah. So I was just going through my notes on Euthyphro, thinking about how I would approach this topic of what is piety. And it got me thinking about how I was raised with my moral code, like, and how that was influenced by religion. And I wonder how the religion that you were raised with, how communism led to a certain moral code, and when were you able to kind of think about that in your own terms and make your own moral code, and maybe think that some things that you learned were not, not correct, like that your friend going to private school made him an enemy, right?
Right. An enemy of the working class, right?
Yeah.
The aesthetics and ethic of communism did influence me as a kid, and that can be boiled down to helping the poor, wanting to help the poor.
Right. You've expressed that you had this interest in poverty generally.
Right.
When you first went into university, you were expecting to study
economics. So there are only 3 points in this list. So one is wanting to help the poor.
Yeah.
2, I would say, is simple living, voluntary poverty, which we still do now in this apartment. I mean, I'm sorry, it's still, and 3, I would say, would be an overall kind of ersatz militarism. Like I've mentioned this to you many times, growing up, being ready for World War III, wanting to be ready for World War III. Not that I actually am, but that sense of it, and the push-ups and the
I mean, you seem to take it more seriously. Like you expressed that your mom one time observed you doing push-ups. And you were
but this is what I was going to say. But even those 3 points, so these are very vague elements. So obviously, this isn't anything as specific as like Marxist dialectical materialism or specific principles from Lenin and Stalin and what have you. Growing up, what you see is your parents utterly failing to practice what they preach.
Right.
What you see is your parents utterly failing to live up to, the aesthetic the ethics of their own moral system.
Right. With communism, I can totally see that being,
Right. No, because
you would view it as very.
I asked my parents. I remember being a small child. See, again, most of my memories, I can remember kind of how tall I was and which house we were in, but I don't remember the year. But I remember being a small child, so I don't know if I was 8 years old or what. And I remember asking my parents about getting gun training, about getting military training, and they laughed at me. And I was like, "Look, I'm serious. We're talking about World War III. We're talking about the revolution and so on." I said, "How do you think Che Guevara, prepare?" I remember I had examples. How do you think Ho Chi Minh prepared for? So Ho Chi Minh was the leader of revolution in Vietnam. Che Guevara was the leader of revolution in Cuba. I was like, how do these people do it? How do you expect me to do it if you don't provide me with this kind of training? And I can even remember what the response was too. But the point is, you're growing up asking those questions and looking around for that. And then, the reality of who my parents were was that they were kind of utterly corrupt and decadent bourgeois people.
Right. Their business was a capitalist business.
Yeah. But even so, even within that, did my parents, even given that, you could own a capitalist business and still be a sincere communist. Most are. Did they ever give a fuck about feeding the homeless? Did they ever give a fuck about going out and helping poor migrant farm workers? You could. From Toronto, you could go out and get involved with, there are Nicaraguan illegal immigrants here working on the farms. When I was a kid, that was the case. In Southern Ontario, a lot of Nicaraguans and people from that part of Latin America coming and picking apples and strawberries and the shit we farm in Southern Ontario. There was no sincerity. There was no personal engagement of that kind. So of course there was sincerity in other ways. I'm just saying they weren't living up to the aesthetic or the ethics of things.
But those ethics are a lot, in my opinion, more difficult to live up to than the basics of most of the commandments in the Bible. Don't steal, don't kill. These were fairly easy and were demonstrated by my parents, But with communism, actually going out and helping the poor, as you, I don't know, be the poor.
Well, look, there's more. Obviously, this isn't like advice for communists. There's more than one way to be a communist. I think there is more than one way to try to live up to that ethic and that aesthetic. But for me as a kid, it was just figuring out my parents had no interest in trying. What they were interested in doing was going to the opera in Paris. Sorry, opera is not that great example.
Yeah, right.
My father's passion was
they weren't living in a communist country. They've never lived in a communist country.
That is true.
If you really believed in it, why didn't you move to China? Why didn't you move to
I don't even know if they ever visited.
Soviet Union?
I mean, during communism, I don't think they ever visited Russia or Cuba. What have you?
Yeah, my mom actually did visit Berlin.
Oh yeah, in the old days.
In East Germany. Yeah.
So. My father tells the story that he applied to migrate to Cuba at a certain point in his life.
Right.
But a lot of things about that story seem like a story he made up. It's just, now looking back at it as an adult, it's like, maybe there's 20% of truth to it or something. But the story, as he told, though, just because it is a short story, he claimed that basically the Cuban embassy told him, if you become a dentist, we'll invite, but get a profession, get a respectable job like being a dentist, and then we'll let you migrate to Cuba. So it's not that hard to believe. But yeah. So at one point he was interested in that. But yeah, so I just want to emphasize, though. So you asked, in what ways did the teachings kind of shape me growing up? It shaped those questions about the difference between the rich and the poor. Why are some people rich and why are some people poor? As I say, it shaped the question of, I was really haunted by the genocide of our native people. There were just a couple of buildings in Old Toronto that had a sign up in an indigenous language and things. It shapes those kinds of questions. But then what you realize is, one, my parents don't have the answers, and two, the answers my parents do have are totally wrong, totally immoral, and totally preoccupied with justifications for mass murder. This unbelievably terrible history of communism. And it's not like the future of communism is better. It's really not like these people saying, oh, no, next time it'll be better. Really what they're promising is next time it'll be the same. Next time it'll be, the cycle of history. I'll just say, it's not like they're saying it's not like they're saying they're renouncing violence from now on, which, some groups do that. They have a period of being violent, they change. There isn't any change like that. No, they believe in class struggle. They believe in, very literally decapitating the aristocrats and the rich.
It's really heavy stuff for a kid when did you learn about the French Revolution? When did you learn about the massacres?
I remember. So again, we just saw the movie The Death of Stalin.
Yeah.
I remember my sister saying to me that she'd always remember the day that our father said that he considered Stalin the greatest man in history. And this impact on her. And it's a funny thing because I can't remember my father ever saying anything that unsophisticated to me. Different people, even if they're not aware of it, they kind of put their guard up. And I was a shrewd kid. And, all kids can be cruel. All kids can be mocking.
Oh, yeah.
Even my daughter already at age 5, once in a while, she kind of says things that are, and it did. Even when I was a kid, it did hurt my parents' feelings when I said things that, called their beliefs into question or made them feel foolish, made them feel ignorant. If I, was asking questions they couldn't answer stuff, which is pretty easy to do in communism. I pointed out contradictions within what they believe and this sort of thing. So I can't remember my father ever saying something that blunt and unsophisticated to me. Instead, when he talked to me about Stalin, there had to be a lot of, baffle gab of saying, well, whereas, mistakes were made and there were massacres and so on, nevertheless, you know what I mean? It was really much more that kind of thing. Yeah.
So you would have been 10 or so when the Berlin Wall fell?
Right. Yeah.
Collapse of the Soviet Union.
Right. I'm born in 1978, so 11, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. How did that affect how your parents approached communism?
It affected me. I think my parents, were shell shocked. It's kind of an overused metaphor, but I remember my reaction to it. I remember me even talking to children in the schoolyard about it.
Really?
I remember my asking my parents questions about it. And I remember you were just not being able to cope with it at all. The Berlin Wall was one of the pillars of the earth, for them. It defined, defined everything. And, I'd say the term cognitive dissonance is overused, but they lived with the awareness, they lived with the knowledge that if they themselves had lived in Russia under Stalin, they would have been killed. They would have been liquidated. My father said it to me several times, not many times. I can remember specifically. So they knew if they had lived in Russia, basically during any of the periods of history when communism was taken seriously, they would have been murdered one way or another by the communist regime. They knew they were in effect too free thinking.
Yet they still
and too libertine. Let's be blunt. To live in that regime. So they were morally approving of a regime that they knew would have killed them and did kill a lot of people like them, right? So, but on the other hand, they were trying to justify the way at that time there was a lot of attention on how Russia was treating the Czech Republic, how they were treating, East Germany, the part of Berlin they had occupied and so on. The treatment of those peoples, they were a little bit more exposed to the kind of the press, and there was a little bit more attention on them. And so they're trying to justify a form of oppression that they're aware they themselves wouldn't be able to endure, And then with the fall of the Berlin Wall, all that excuse making, all that rationalization suddenly doesn't make sense anymore. What was the point? What was it all about?
Right.
But they never in front of me, showed whatever process they went through. But many years later, probably about 10 years later, I can remember my father reading a poem in one of the communist newspapers, communist publications he was getting. And it was a poem the poem was basically saying, oh, don't worry, we can go back in time. The fall of the Berlin Wall was all a mistake. And, we can go back to the old days of Joseph Stalin, this kind of thing. This is the sentiment of the poem. I can remember my father having a really emotional reaction to that poem. But I don't know if they ever processed it. I remember whenever that was on the news, because I was on the news a lot at that time when I was a kid. So it was on the news a lot for like a whole year. It wasn't like one day story. There were all these consequences of the story, including these just mentioning. There were like news stories about like the actual physical pieces of the Berlin Wall, where they were going to be like stored and shit. Yeah. Like, oh, this one's being put into a museum and this one's, so just say it stayed in the news. And I remember them always being very blank and very sort of distantiated, in dealing with this. But at the same time, I remember we met and knew. I'd love to know what happened to that guy. We met and knew a family, and they were refugees from the Czech Republic. And again, they were probably my father thought of himself as that sort of person also, who'd be persecuted by communism.
Mm-hmm.
And I expected my father to be harsh and condemning towards them because they were anti-communist, and my father wasn't. He was very sympathetic. He really, I remember his reaction to meeting them and chatting with them.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an unbridgeable gulf there. And that, anyway, maybe that's one of the defining marks of real communism. If you take communism seriously, you have to believe in massacring innocent people. But my father at least was very much cognizant that these people were innocent. It's not that they deserve to be massacred or something. Yeah. So peculiar ideology. Yeah. And a real contrast to Christianity or what have you.
Despite all of its flaws, being raised, you mentioned that you had these discussions at the dinner table. Yeah. Being raised with a political religion. Yes. I can see the many benefits from it because you care about politics and you are very well versed. And from a young age, you read political works.
Right.
I have not read anything real political until just recently, and that wasn't ever emphasized when I was growing up. The importance of actually.
So just to acknowledge that we're getting the questions from the audience. So Ghost of Karl Marx, glad you stuck with us, Ghost of Karl Marx. Ghost of Karl Marx asks, what did your father think of anarchism? So, his type of response to that, what would be typical, this would be the first thing he'd say, but sometimes it would be the only thing he'd say. He would say, well, I think it's mistaken, this emphasis on the individual. So you'll hear critics of communism saying that more often than communists. He was a real communist in that he believed in collectivization and losing your individual identity, of the individual not being real. Normally it's only critics of communism say that. It's not people who support the ideology, but he believed that, and so for him that was enough to kind of debunk anarchism. Like, well, people don't exist. Like only abstractions. Like only group identity exists. So that's a remarkable thing. Now I could mention other comments he made about it. Yeah. Mostly based on the one big real historical example of anarchism is Spain. Is Spanish anarchism and the Spanish Civil War, which of course was negative from a communist perspective. But
we just mentioned that you had heard your dad reading a poem.
And
You've mentioned at other times that your dad would read articles from the newspaper and emphatically
you get very really theatrical.
Yeah,
that's the word, is theatrical.
Right. I have no clue. How that would have. How having a presence like that in the household when I was growing up would have influenced me and changed me for the better or for the worse. I don't really know. But, coming from somebody whose father didn't read, like he, just watched TV all the time, like actually having that emphasis on reading and paying attention to world news and paying attention to political ideology, I think, I can see some value to it, even though I definitely wouldn't.
So look, I agree. I have a couple of responses to this. First point is real. I have two responses to this. One, so my father had 9 kids.
Yeah.
It only had this effect on me, right? So I responded this way, where as you described, care about political ideology, care about paying attention to politics. I'm making these connections. I'm worried about, World War III coming, all this stuff. Of the other 8 kids, I don't think even one responded to the stimulus in this way, right? And now, so my own sister, I have 2 sisters out of the 9, but so it's a pretty high failure rate. I think you're right that it did succeed in my case.
Your sister got a PhD.
She's never given a fuck about politics. She doesn't give a fuck about the poor. She doesn't give. She doesn't have a humanitarian bone in her body. I'm sorry, but saying she has a PhD. Sorry, you can have a PhD in chemistry. That means I'm sorry. There's no connection to this. Sorry, but PhD is just your level of education. But no, that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about getting a PhD. We're talking about taking some kind of political impetus from this or sense of direction. Yeah. No. Anyway, so I just say, and some of my other brothers have respectable careers. one of them is an archaeologist, but again, not a political bone in his body, and so on. But yeah, you make an interesting broad point in saying that growing up with communism as a religion, you are growing up with this worldly, religion. You're growing up with a religion that's based on real events, historical and present. Well, it's above all else, it's a fetish about history, if anything. But the French Revolution. I mean, the history of every revolution, but the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, that cares about history and what have you.
Right. It's based off of real people. Mao and Lenin were real people. It's not based off of Jesus, an imaginary figure. That,
that's right.
And it's based on actual history, not made up stories like Noah's Ark. This is
right, but with the caveat that they're telling a lot of lies.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, the history itself is quite fictionalized.
That's true.
It's
true. But...
So just to mention briefly, I think I've told you this about this verbally at one point, but one of the books that was on my childhood bookshelf was a cartoon history of the Russian Revolution. Probably someone else remembers this book. There must have been. It was obvious that a lot of them have been published. It was published by some Communist Party of the USA or something, I forget. But it was a history of the revolution with illustrations, and it seemed down to earth and it seemed honest, and I remember the opening pages. It said, "Look, different people tell a lot of different lies about what happened during the Russian Revolution." Yeah, getting chilly now.
No.
Okay,
Okay.
all right. Okay, you can put the jacket.
Don't have any more questions prepared.
Oh, okay. It said, there were a lot of lies told. Some people say this, some people say that. So it really seemed like it was presenting with the balanced truth. Yeah. Whereas many years later that I realized, like, almost everything in this book was a lie. Like everything it was telling you about the Russian Revolution.
Yeah.
But no, you're right. I mean, it is connected to real history, and real human suffering and tragedy. I mean, as a child, anyway, it plugs you into reality that way if you're susceptible to be plugged into it. Sure.
Right.
Yeah. So we saw Death of Stalin.
Death of Stalin. Yeah.
Do you want to tack on a movie review at this point or what?
Yeah, I thought it was a really
I had
good
things
movie.
to say about this, but anyway, I don't know if I'll remember what I had to say about Grove Cops. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the best movies I've seen in a long time. It was entertaining, and I thought it was actually, I did laugh out loud funny. You said that you didn't actually laugh out loud.
Yeah.
But I found the humor to my liking at some points. And it was just, you've said that some parts of it were not totally historically accurate, which is to be expected from a big budget film like this. But
it's a dramatization,
yeah, but not so much as while we were watching it, one of the previews was for a movie coming up about Karl Marx that clearly looks like propaganda.
Wow, Marxist really, propaganda in a mainstream movie coming out.
Yeah, right? It really does. But I didn't get that impression from this movie. That it wasn't glorifying Stalin. It wasn't glorifying any of his posse, any of his gang. So yeah, that was interesting for me because I'm not familiar with this history, and I didn't know about the death of Stalin until I saw the movie.
Yeah. And for me, I felt the greatest strength of the movie was just portraying all of the historical characters as real human beings.
Mm-hmm.
They did that for the purposes of comedy, but from my perspective, the main effect of the comedy was just humanizing the people involved, that they were very human. They had very relaxed human conversations. To me, it really wasn't funny. It wasn't laugh out loud funny. But it was nice to see those people portrayed as human, all too human.
I think that might have to do with the fact that you've done so much research and so much about history. And I remember you whispering to me, you were like, I never thought I would see these characters being portrayed in a movie.
Right.
But so for you, it's like this kind of, I think you are more inclined to take it seriously than.
Right. I mean, for me, it was really just like a real serious historical drama, but with this much more human element where people don't act like statues. They behave in a more, their manner of speaking is more human and relaxed and so on.
Yeah, but it's so I don't know, it's just so foreign. And the one of the funny parts to me was once Stalin died, the committee trying to figure out what their policy should be and feeling like they're somehow being impious, that they are going against their leader when they want to change, want to do something different, want to stop the mass murders, want to stop the mass arrests.
Right.
And kind of going back and forth about like whether this is good for the country or good for communism.
I mean, like obviously, but the film gives you a sense in broad outline of what it was like living under that regime. And the reason then for making this video is, what is it like growing up with people who glorify and make excuses for that regime?
Yeah.
I mean, there are all these questions surrounding Stalinism and so on. I mean, and the other side of it that's sick is, for so many years, the Cold War provided this huge distraction where it was like anything bad the United States did, they'd say, well, it's not as bad as what the Russians are doing. And even though that's true, I mean, it's like, what is this, a race to the bottom for who can have the lowest standards? Like, yes, I mean, it's true. Like, for example, during the same period of history, you can say, well, the Americans are treating African Americans very badly, which is true. The status of black people in America was really, really terrible. But people really did say back, oh, well, they're treated better than the ethnic minorities than Russia. And it's like, well, like, why don't you set your standards a little bit higher? Like, yeah, I mean, because it was absolutely, nightmarish. Yeah, it's bizarre. I mean, something else that came out of the movie, I don't know if you remember me saying this, when we left, I pointed out to you, I mean, there's this huge literature produced by Russian communism. And then the minute the life and death threat disappeared, the minute they stopped holding a gun to people's heads, nobody read any of those books. They all, everyone suddenly recognized they had no literary value. They weren't entertaining. They weren't interesting, right? And this includes the final work of Joseph Stalin, his posthumous work, the book he was writing right up to his death. It was like 98% completed his death, and then it was published after his death. Nobody read it. If it had been published during his life, everybody would have read it. You kind of wouldn't have a choice. It would be in the curriculum and so on. But it was his supposed, masterpiece. And yeah, I mean, we also just talked about, it seems to us like freedom of speech is such a weak tool these days. How does freedom of speech really shape the world and change the world? But that was a regime that couldn't cope with allowing freedom of speech. We talked about it a lot after the film. I was pointing out to you, like in this period after the death of Stalin, they sort of experimented with, they tried to have a little bit of freedom of speech. But as soon as you had a little bit of freedom of speech, you started getting allegations coming in against government officials and bureaucrats that they'd murdered people, they'd raped people, they'd tortured people, just various.
Guilty of.
Yeah, right. And, sometimes just reports of criminal activity, within the government. Just, as soon as you had any freedom of speech, or even the reports about starvation and stuff, reports about shortages. As soon as you have a newspaper that can publish a letter or something complaining about this stuff, this shakes the regime to its core. So yeah, that's a real difference. But anyway, sorry, we're not even comparing something else. But that was one of the themes that came out of that. And I guess the ego trap that people in my parents were stuck in was exactly that. They did have the freedom of speech. They did have the access to information. They knew all the things and had the freedom to talk about all the things that people inside Russia couldn't talk about and couldn't read about, or not easily, not openly. And so the only people who remained communist in a country like Canada were really crazy and really committed and really engaged in a kind of a very pious form of self-deception. I mean, how do you continue believing in Stalin after Stalin has been totally discredited within Russia?
Yeah.
That's really the question, because that's exactly what happened after the death of Stalin. The film doesn't go into that period.
Well,
but by the 1980s, I mean, the 1980s is totally discredited. I mean, it takes some time. How do you continue believing in Mao Zedong, so the leader of Chinese communism, after he's been totally discredited within China? When the official Communist Party history even regrets that stuff.
Well, it was obvious that, at least in the portrayal in the movie, that they wanted to make changes immediately after Stalin had died. That they thought that what he had done in arresting so many people just a couple days prior was an error.
And they all had friends. I mean, the film just alludes to that, but they all had friends and girlfriends and lovers who had disappeared into the gulags.
Yeah, right.
So Stalin's, they don't explain to you, but Stalin's daughter is weeping because of a boyfriend, we presume, who's disappeared into the
because
gulags. And yeah, it may or may not be exactly the historical reality they're following here, because she did have one lover. There is a real historical story. But regardless, in terms of how the film depicts it, you see everyone has been touched by this kind of repression.
Yeah.
So everyone knows the harm it can do. Yeah.
One thing that we were talking about was that this was really an aristocratic group. Yeah, like.
Well, that right. Yeah, that goes back to what I said earlier about the aesthetics of communism. Go on. Yeah.
No, it relates to what you were just saying, because one of the I forget his name, but when he was talking to Stalin's daughter, he said, "I'll make an exception," or like I'll do what I can to find your boyfriend Alexei or whatever.
Right.
And it turns out he's been killed in the gulag, gulag, and he can't bring him back from the dead. So, but he's pulling out the stops for this special, person, because it's the daughter of Stalin, and they really have this aristocrat. And it's the beginning. It takes place in this big mansion or cabin of Stalin's, and they had servants, and
all the scenes inside the halls of power in the government are in these aristocratic palaces with marble columns and sumptuous Russian imperial decorations and so on.
Yeah. One of the scenes was really notable. It was just this huge gate.
Yes, right. And to me, all that's sickening too. I mean, the look. I mean, both the poison and the medicine of communism is the promise of equality. So, I mean, you just read about Sparta. In many ways, the written description of Sparta, not the historical reality, but the somewhat glamorized written description of what ancient Sparta was like, was this huge inspiration to communists and other political extremists, probably also fascists. And again, with Sparta, kind of the bait on the hook, is equality. But in Sparta's case, it's at least an attempt at literal equality. There's no money, allegedly, footnote. In reality, Sparta had money. Everyone wears the same clothing. Everyone eats the same food.
All boys are educated the same way.
Yes.
Everyone has to be in the military.
Right. Everyone does the same military service. Everyone wears the same shirt.
Yeah.
There's one tunic. Everybody wears the same shirt. Nobody. That's another one that wasn't in your video. Nobody in Sparta was allowed to carry a lamp or a lantern.
Yeah.
Because if one person has a lantern, everybody's going to want a lantern. No lanterns for anyone. In the dark, walk in the dark. It'll toughen you up. It'll make you better at walking in the dark barefoot. Everyone's got to be barefoot walking in the dark. Right.
Can't get drunk and try to make it home in the dark.
Yeah, that's right. So but I mean, the meaning of equality in Sparta is very clear. And then you look at these, communist despotisms, and it's just a new aristocracy in every meaningful sense. You've just created new aristocrats, including the hereditary element. That it does go from father to son. I mean, the first generation of aristocrats, this is true in most aristocratic systems, is created by a war or a civil war. The very first aristocrats are soldiers of some kind or war heroes or something. But then the next generation they're in power because they're the children of the war heroes. So it really becomes nothing but an aristocracy. And it even has the trappings, even has the aesthetics. They're not making any effort to wear the same shirt as everyone else, or live in the same house as everyone else, or to starve when everyone else is starving. They're living in this kind of, to me, unforgivable, splendor in the midst of, the very poverty and starvation their fucking dictatorship is creating.
Right. Yeah. And just the sheer power that was given to Stalin is an example of that. And one example from the movie is they were trying to replicate a portrait of Stalin with a young girl, and they were like, okay, we need to do everything to find the same girl so that she can be in the photo with the new head of the state. And so anyway, just knowing and seeing the extravagance of the funeral that was given for Stalin too.
And I mean, everyone's calling each other comrade. I mean, comrade means we're equals, right?
Yeah.
Anyway,
but
there's a very clear hierarchy to who some people are more comrade than others.
Yeah.
And
it was interesting to see the power struggle to see who would come into power after.
Anyway, for me, I could talk about this all day. Part of the kind of heartbreak of this history So the winner, as presented in this movie, is Nikita Khrushchev. And then it ends by saying, well, Nikita Khrushchev was in power until one day there was a coup d'etat against him, which is true. And, I've said before in other videos, Nikita Khrushchev was a relatively hopeful figure. He's not remembered as one of the great monsters of history, the way Stalin was, the way Lenin is. But I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought. For once, I've managed to lose my train of thought.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, this is what I was going to say. For me, there's this issue of Nikita Khrushchev promising reform and promising to be moderate.
Mm.
And when you're in a system like this, who is moderate? You guys go into the history of this. One of the reasons why Stalin rose to power in the first place was that he was perceived as moderate. He was the moderate anti-war candidate compared to the other guys he was competing with for the leadership at the time. Well, he gets into power and he's not so moderate. I mean, even Khrushchev, who I say is not remembered as that terrible a leader. So when Khrushchev is coming to power, why are people supporting him? Because he's a moderate, he's against the massacres, he's against the gulag, he's against this repression of free speech, he's promising liberalization and reform. And so once he gets into power, how different is it really from Stalin's period? Now, there was an improvement. I mean, as I say, it wasn't as terrible as, but they still had still was fundamentally the same horrible communist system. I'm sorry, it still was. It was Stalin light was what it was. It was Stalin followed by Stalin light. That's the reality, right? So I mean, they didn't make
now introducing Stalin light.
Exactly. They still didn't have newspapers or elections or any of the things you might have, and the starvation problems went on, and so on and so forth. And still, nobody had the freedom to criticize the government and all these things. And then the other thing that's tragic here, which they kind of allude to, but you don't really get at, there's the sense of Beria. So Beria, Beria, right? But that for me is the tragedy talking. It is a real historical fact, in as much as we can know anything is a real historical fact, that Beria was at this time apparently offering real reform, real liberalization, and peace with the United States. That's what he was going for, was an end to the Cold War and an end to the negative elements of Stalinism. Even though Beria really
a horrible rapist,
right? I mean, he may hold the record as having raped the most women of anyone in the 20th century. It's really, if anyone else in that century could have raped as many women as him, he has an unbelievable record as a sexual predator, as a torturer, and so on. And yet, perhaps because he very much was Stalin's right hand man, he very much was Stalin's bag man.
Right.
He carried out the killings and what have you. But is it for that reason, or is it despite that reason, that Beria was actually the pro-reform, pro-liberalization, pro-democracy, pro-peace figure? The minute Stalin died, he thought, here's my chance. Or is it even that he wanted to have a redemption arc, that he wanted to go from being Beria, the most hated, butcher, the butcher of Moscow or whatever, to being remembered in history as the great man who brought the Soviet Union back into the normal world, made it into a normal country again. He thought, this is my chance to redeem myself. What was going on there in terms of real history? And then again, I mean, looking back at that, is it a tragedy or is it something we should celebrate that Beria was snuffed out? I mean, in terms of the difference between real world morality and storybook morality or logical morality. I mean, what a horrifying thought that Beria, one, Beria might have been a better dictator than Stalin. Two, because everyone blamed Beria for the horrors of Stalin because he actually carried them out. He carried out the orders. He carried out the torture and interrogation and what have you. And then two, that Beria might have actually been a better leader than Nikita Khrushchev. So to me, that's kind of profoundly unsettling. It's not unsettling in a shallow sense, the way a horror movie is or something. But, wow, there's this alternate history where Beria got his way. And then, what I said to Melissa, I don't have to give Melissa morality lectures, but it really is an interesting morality lecture. Beria couldn't carry out his reform plan. He couldn't do because he was number 2 in the chain of command. He could have replaced Stalin. He could have taken over the leadership. And that would have ended the Cold War, would have ended the threat of nuclear war. The whole world would be different today. Yeah. And Russia would probably be profoundly better off. but he couldn't because he had discredited himself ethically. I mean, he was tainted, so it's like, well, I mean, there's a real lesson in that. One of the reasons to be a kind of moral and upstanding person, is so that you can do things that are even totally unrelated. There's no relationship between Beria's sex life and his political convictions. I think that's what the historical record shows. And that's even shown in this movie. Like, okay, so this guy's a horrible rapist, but even he sees the Gulag system as evil, etc. Even he wants, again, they didn't touch on this. He wanted peace with America and some kind of fundamental shift towards democracy and freedom and just normalcy, just being a normal country, whatever, not being this unbelievably horrible place. Yeah, but even though your sex life is not related to your political convictions, your sex life can totally vitiate, totally undermine, you totally discredit your political aspirations, and everything can. I mean, I feel that way about other vegans, like other vegans who kind of dabble in racism, who are kind of soft-core racist. Well, in a sense, racism is unrelated to veganism, but guess what? This totally discredits you, as a vegan leader. I think there are all kinds of examples of that. This YouTube channel probably discredits me and in a lot of my political aspirations. We'll see if I run for mayor. We'll see if this very YouTube video, discredits me. So yeah, that's another lesson to take from the movie. Yeah. Okay, thanks for coming on live stream with me, babe. We don't now that she has her own YouTube channel, we don't do so many recordings together. But that was spontaneous. We didn't talk about any of the stuff we thought I'd talk about, but I think we laid down a lot of quality content. Yeah. Okay, this is our first time live streaming directly over YouTube. Seems like there were no technical problems. Shout out to David. Shout out to Ghost of Karl Marx. Shout out to Give Me a Kiss. Shout out to everyone who joined us.
Night, David.
Hey, man. I mean, look. I mean, I think everyone knows the ultimate irony is, veganism also is one of these grand missions to save the world, save the planet. And, obviously, coming out of the shadow of communism, my engagement with Buddhism, my engagement with humanitarian work, my engagement with economics, that'd be a whole separate video. Economics and political science, but especially economics. Economics is the sacred science of communism. Yeah. Some of those moral and aesthetic concerns obviously carried over from my being raised communist into my anti-communist adulthood. And all you guys, I hope, still are trying to save the planet.